On this super review, let's take a look at another pair of Dudios true wireless earbuds, the Free Mini. So I've reviewed quite a few different true wireless earbuds on this channel, and my favorites so far are these. Is that how it goes? The Dudios Zeus Ace. They're not very expensive, they're around 30 bucks, and they're just surprisingly good. That said, Dudios has got a new pair, which they're calling the Free Mini, and their packaging is looking a little bit different, so I'm not sure if it's gonna be quite as good, but that's something that we're gonna find out. But I'm also gonna take this opportunity to compare these new Dudios to a couple of other true wireless earbuds that have come into the studio in between like now and the last time I did a roundup like this. So let's go ahead and open up the Free Mini. We'll see what we get inside, and then I'll come back and I'll give you a little breakdown of how all these different true wireless earbuds stack up. So we can start by talking about the Earphone Free. I think that's what they call them. The model number they've got listed here is the TW100, but if you look them up on Indiegogo, which is where they're at right now, they are called the Earphone Free. And it's worth calling out that these things are currently, as far as I can tell, only available on Indiegogo. And that's something that you should consider with some trepidation. I think that Indiegogo is, like Kickstarter, it's a cool thing, but there is some risk. And I've had some people tell me before that some products that I've reviewed that they thought were interesting, they went and tried to buy them on Indiegogo and ended up having issues. So with some caution, consider these things. So right now they're going for around $50, which is on the high end of these different Bluetooth headphones that I'm comparing. The general shape and build of this thing is pretty similar to the Dudios Zeus Ace, which before this batch of headphones, the Dudios Zeus Ace is my #1 pick in this budget true wireless market. And yeah, I think that the build here and the shape is pretty nice. The case is on the large side a little bit, but it is a little bit nicer built than the Dudios. Just kind of some of the details, right? You get little LEDs on the front of it to tell you what the battery life is. I think that's a nice touch. You've just got, a nice edges around here. Also worth calling out is that this is the only case of the earphones here that I'm reviewing that has wireless charging, and I think that's pretty cool. Tried it out on my wireless charger and I didn't have any issues with it, so yeah, I think that's good. Also, this is the only one that I'm reviewing that has got USB-C. And I don't think that's a big deal, but it is a nice touch. If you've got modern devices that have got all USB-C, this is such a better port than micro USB. So it's nice to have it here. Again, not like a make it or break it feature, but I do appreciate it. All of the earbuds that I'm looking at today have got some sort of IPX certification, but these, the Earphone Frees, are the ones that have got the strongest certification. I forget exactly what it is, IPX 7, something like that. But they actually claim that these things can be fully submerged in water. Now, I didn't try it, but I guess that's got to say something, right? That they've at least got that certification on them. Speaking about these buds, these are a little bit on the bulky side. compared to some others, but I found that when wearing them, it wasn't an issue, at least in my ears, and I don't think I have particularly large ears. I found that these things were plenty comfortable. You know, they've got a stem that will extend into the inner part of your ear, and generally I found that they did a pretty good job and they stayed put. They've also got a physical button for playback, pause and playback controls. And when it comes to these wireless earbuds, some of them will have touch controls, some will have physical buttons, and personally, I prefer having a physical button. I think because this earbud is, you know, relatively large, I didn't have any issues with accidentally pressing the button while handling them. And that's just kind of something that you kind of learn to deal with a lot of wireless earbuds. And well, I didn't have to worry about it with the earphones. And then when it comes to the sound signature of the Earphone Free, I would say that it's kind of a balanced to warm sound, which is just to say that there's quite a bit of bass and not a ton of emphasis in the upper mid-range. Versus like the Dudios Zeus Ace, there's definitely less upper mid-range here and probably more bass. If that's what you want, that's what you got. For me, I would say it's actually a little bit too much bass, you know, depending on the song. With some music, it could definitely be a lot too much bass, and with other music, it was fine. I found that the treble kind of plays in the background on these things, and because of that, it gives it a relatively narrow soundstage. It just feels a little bit more claustrophobic than some of the other earbuds that I've got. So, you know, nothing offensive about the sound here, but it's also not my favorite. So while sound quality, not exactly my favorite here with the Earphone, I think that the build quality and the wireless charging and some of the other features in this thing make this actually a pretty solid option, and I would give these things 4 stars out of 5. And then here we've got the crazy baby Nano 1S. I think that's the entirety of the name. And right off the bat, well, one, these things have got a pretty unique form factor compared to the other ones I've got here, right? Rather than having a lid, these things open like that. These things are also, I think, well, okay, I don't think. These things are by far the most expensive here. These things cost around $130 right now. And I think for that money, mostly what you're paying for is this unique form factor. And actually, I lied about the earphones being the only USB-C because I forgot that these things actually have USB-C as well. All right, so apart from that, you know, it's a unique case design, but there is a little bit of jank here. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a little bit of wiggle and give, but it does close with magnets. And I think overall, you know, when it's in this closed state, it's got a nice form factor. It's smaller, I think a lot more convenient than something like the earphones or even the Dudios Zeus Ace. Just the shape of it, I think slides in and out of a pocket a lot more easily. It does have a little bit of a rated R look to it, but that's something that you get with this shape. The earpods themselves are, I think, the smallest of all the ones that I tried. I mean, I didn't measure them by volume or anything, but these things are pretty teeny tiny, which you would think would actually work pretty well for people with small ears, and maybe that is the case. But one thing that's worth calling out is that there's very short stems on these things. So while some of the other earbuds are actually a little bit bigger and bulkier, because these things have such short stems, they don't actually go that deep into the inside of an ear. And personally, you know, I don't do a ton of exercise, I'll be honest, but I did go for a run with these things, and I had a little bit of trouble keeping them in my ears, especially in my left ear. And so, not because there's anything wrong with the left version of this versus the right, just my ears happen to be slightly different shaped. You do have a physical button on the outside of this thing, which I think is positive. But like I mentioned with the earphones, because, well, the earphones are large, and because of that, it's pretty easy to handle them without accidentally pressing the button. But these things, the crazy babies, are pretty small, and it makes it difficult to put this thing in my ear without accidentally pressing the button. It's not a big issue, but it is something that you're probably going to deal with, is that at least me personally, I got a lot more accidental button presses with these than I did with pretty much anything else. And then in terms of sound signature with the Crazy Baby, these are by far the strongest sort of V sound, which is to say that there's a lot of bass emphasis, there's some treble emphasis, and then the mid-range is just quite gutted. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think that these things sound pretty fun, and they sound a little bit a little bit more open soundstage versus something like the Earphones. I think the Earphones have a more balanced sound that I prefer personally, but these things might be a little bit more fun. And again, if you're into big bass, I think you might like the sound here. Really, for me, the biggest downside with the sound is that the mids just get really kind of lost, and they don't sound bad. Well, I don't know, they don't sound great, but they don't sound terrible. These things are just, it's a decent sounding earphone that I think goes for a fun sound that for me is not quite what I'm looking for. A couple of things that are interesting to point out about this case. One, which is not my favorite, is that these earbuds I found were the most fiddly to put back into the case. They're just a little bit more particular, actually a lot more particular, about being positioned exactly right in order for them to fit and magnetically attach to the little chargers in there. So that's one downside. One plus side, which I found, I don't know, surprisingly convenient, is that, well, this thing is perfectly round, and you would expect, I would expect, for this thing to have an issue with rolling around, but look at this. Okay, it rolls, but mostly it's weighted to the bottom, so it pretty much stays in place. I didn't have any issue with this thing rolling off a table, and I appreciate that. If I were to rate the Crazy Baby Nano 1S out of 5 stars, I'd give these things a very solid 3 stars. Here we've got the Q Labs. Let's see if I can get this product name correct. The QTW1. This was the most unique, interesting in some ways, but also, in my opinion, clearly the standout worst option here. The general build quality is not bad, but it does feel cheaper than the others. To that point, like, these are the only ones here where the lid is like snapping closed rather than magnetically closing. And is that a big deal? Not really in practical reality, but it does give them sort of a cheaper vibe. On the other hand, these are the only earphones here that came with a nice little wrist strap, and that's kind of appreciated. The size of this thing, I would say, is kind of in the middle of the Dudios and Earphones on one side, and then like the Crazy Baby Nano on this side. That it's a little bit bulky, but it's not bad. These things fit in and out of a pocket pretty easily, and a lot of that comes down to the shape, as well as actually this little handle makes it easy. If you leave this thing dangling out of your pocket, it makes it easy to pull this thing out of the pocket. In terms of aesthetics, these things are the loudest, which might not stand out right here. It kind of just looks plain and black, but let's see if I can get these things to light up, because these things have got all kinds of lights. You got blue lights on those things that turn into red lights when this thing's charging. When you close this thing, you can see little blue lights glowing inside. And it's kind of a cool look, I suppose, but definitely, again, the loudest looking headphone here. Also worth calling out that these things are not very cheap. These things are $50. So for a headphone that I think feels like it's got the cheapest build, it's a little disappointing to see that the price is not necessarily reflective of that. The last point on the build that, I think betrays the fact that these things are relatively expensive is that these things just have the nastiest driver flex. And so what that is that when you plug these things into your ears, the air pressure that gets created from these things sealing and then the inside of your ear, you hear the plastic driver inside of it just kind of crinkling. And this is, I would say, the worst driver flex I've experienced on any earphone. I find it pretty unpleasant. I mean, it doesn't come into play when you're just wearing them. It doesn't ruin the sound or anything like that, and it's not bad for the earphone, I don't think. It just kind of feels nasty, and it feels, I don't know, it's kind of like you're sticking these things in your ear and it sounds like your ears are wet, even though your ears aren't wet. At least my ears weren't wet. Are your ears wet right now? Also worth calling out is the boot up process on these things is just kind of obnoxiously verbose. Like, they each take turns saying something twice and then they say that they're connected. I don't know, a little bit too much for me. And then when it comes to the sound signature, that's where these things are actually, I think, even worse than their build quality. And I don't know, maybe you'll like the sound of these things, because these things are basically just bass. And if that's the only part of the frequency range that you like is the bass, well, you might like the Q Labs, but personally, I like a little bit of mid-range, and I definitely like a little bit of treble. And these things don't really give you much of that. Actually, I would say the mid-range on these is a little bit less muted than it is on the Crazy Babies, but that big bass is just kind of overwhelming everything else. And then the treble is, I don't know where the treble's at, but it just overall gives these things a very muted and kind of an underwater sound. So out of 5 stars, I'd give the Q Labs, I mean, they work totally fine, so I'll give them 2 stars out of 5, but frankly, I wouldn't recommend these. And that brings us to talking about the Dudios Zeus Ace, which is a headphone I've reviewed previously on this channel. And when I reviewed it, it was my favorite true wireless earbud. And I think these things are still really good. Compared to the rest of these other ones that I've tried, these are still my favorite. In terms of sound quality, I think these things are the best. They've got just the best balance of sound where they've got a nice bass punch, but it's not overdone, at least in my opinion. I mean, it's a little bit more overdone than what I would typically like on like a critical listening headphone, but for wireless earbuds, I think this thing is really well done. There's a little bit of upper mid-range lift, and the treble on this is nice, maybe a little bit gritty sounding, but I think it gives it a nice sense of stage that you don't get on all of these other true wireless buds. So I still, I'm still pretty happy with these. About the only complaint that I have is that the case is a little bit on the large side. And there's no wireless charging. It's got USB micro or micro USB, but neither of those issues is a big deal for me because I think the battery life in these things has proven to be pretty great for me. And frankly, I would still give these things 5 stars out of 5. Which brings us to the Dudios Free Mini, which is the latest in the long line, the storied line of Dudios true wireless earbuds. And these things, well, here, let me bring back the Ace just so you can appreciate how much smaller the Free Minis are. I don't know, is that on camera? Does that even look as small as it feels in real life? Because I don't know that it does. This case right here is just significantly smaller, and that makes it significantly more convenient, at least for me. The way that I use these things is I'll keep them in a pocket, and maybe I'm not listening to them, at any given moment, but for me, it's very convenient to have them around. The earbuds themselves are also pretty small, but they're not the smallest here. You can see that, versus something like the crazy baby Nano 1S, however that product name ends. These things are maybe about the same size, but with the addition of a stem. And personally, I'm a fan of the stem. I think it makes these things easier to fit. Now, that said, I did actually have a little bit of an issue creating a consistent seal with these things. Like half the time I put them in my ear, I don't get a good seal, and then half the time I do. So they're just a little bit more particular about fit than something like the Dudios Zeus Ace. The biggest downside though with the Free Minis here is that they've given up the physical push button for tap controls. And man, the tap controls on these things are actually just god-awful. Like seriously, so it's nice that it's a double tap to toggle pause and play, which means you're probably not going to be accidentally triggering pause and play. That's good, but unfortunately, you're probably also not going to be consistently, intentionally triggering pause and play. Like for me, it usually takes at least 3 attempts to actively toggle pause if that's what I'm trying to do. So most of the time I don't even bother. I just put them in and out of the case and don't bother with the touch controls. And that's kind of a big deal. And frankly, kind of a disappointment considering how small and convenient this case is. Does it completely outweigh the convenience of this case? I don't quite think so. And maybe I'm just being a little lenient on these Dudios here, but those tap controls are just not good. Fortunately, when it comes to the sound quality on the Free Minis here, I actually think these things are doing a really good job. And I have a hard time picking between these versus the Dudios Zeus Ace. They're actually very different sound signatures, but I think they're both equally well done. So I would say that the Free Minis here they've got kind of a warmer sound tilt to them, right? They've got nice bass punch, but it's tastefully done. It's not overly emphasized. But versus the Ace, there's less upper mid-range lift here, which means that vocals don't come as far forward. And typically I like an upper mid-range lift. So you would think that I would miss that here, but the treble I think is so well done here on the Free Minis, and I think maybe a little bit better done than the Zeus Ace that it still gives these things a nice sense of space. It still gives them, I don't know, a good soundstage, you know, for a cheap Bluetooth in-ear headphone. Yeah, just a really satisfying sound. And because of that, I still actually really like the Free Minis. Out of 5 stars, I think I'd have to give these things 3 stars out of 5. So while I do quite like these, I don't think that for me they will be replacing the Dudios Zeus Ace. There might be some scenarios where I still prefer these just because of the convenience, but in the true wireless market, you know, if I'm not looking at AirPods, basically if I can't buy AirPods, I think the Zeus Ace is still gonna be my pick. So if you're interested in checking out any of these true wireless earbuds, of course, I've got links in the description down below. I'm not sure which direction to point here, but there are links in the description. While you're down there, you can hit the like button for the video if you liked it. You can subscribe to the channel, and then I'll see you on the next Super Review.